Welcome to Rethinking Economics, a Henry George School podcast series. Rethinking Economics is all about questioning the core foundations of economics. This series questions economic orthodoxy to better understand the forces and shifts shaping our society and the world. Together, we'll interrogate things like the efficacy of economic models, if mainstream assumptions are always correct, and why the ideas and concepts you learn about in textbooks may lead us astray. Today's episode will be the last of a three-part series where I, your host, Nathan Greene, interview a group of my current professors here at Clark University. I was first introduced to the concept of development in my Economic Growth and Development course at St. John's University. There, we explored how economic growth led to improvements in living standards that allowed people to achieve their full potential. This is what Nobel laureate Amartya Sen calls his capability approach, when societies are able to produce the conditions necessary for people to flourish. But since coming to Clark, my idea of development has changed. I began to separate economic development from development in general. Growth wasn't always desirable and could even lead to entrenched inequalities, environmental degradation, or accumulation by dispossession. So I want to ask you, what does development mean to you? Is it different from economic growth? Are the two mutually exclusive? And should we even strive for economic growth? To answer these questions, I've enlisted the help of three of my professors who have helped me shape my understanding of development. Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. David Bell to get a metaphysical understanding of what development really means. Dr. Bell is an international education consultant trained in psychology. He is the founder and director of Ubuntu Consulting, an educational evaluation company where he works as a program evaluation consultant, designing and assessing education initiatives both in the U.S. and globally. Before moving to the United States, Dr. Bell worked extensively in development and educational improvement. He has worked at numerous international NGOs focusing on social change, such as the Center for Cognitive Development, the Kellogg Foundation, and the Karuna Center for Peacebuilding. Much of Dr. Bell's research explores transformational leadership, experiential learning, and the role of education in development. He earned his bachelor's degree in education and counseling psychology from the University of Port Elizabeth, his master's in education and counseling psychology from Rhodes University, and his doctorate of education in education policy, research, administration, and comparative education from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Bell joined the Henry George School to discuss what development means to different people, the difference between economic growth and development, and why people conceptualize these two things so differently. We hope you enjoy this talk, and please make sure to check back on our page every week for a brand new episode. Professor David Bell, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Today, I'm really hoping to unpack what international development is, what the difference is between economic development, and some of the commonalities and the differences between the two. To do this, I think we need to start at the origins of development and kind of unpack what development is as a concept. So could you please tell me where the concept of development came from, where it was first practiced, and how it was thought of?
Big question and wide-ranging in the sense that I don't think it has one common generic encompassing definition. You know, if you use the word development and you use the word international development and you use the word economic development, you can go off in very different directions. So I'm assuming that when you're talking about the word development, you're talking about development as international development. And if you take it purely in its, from my perspective, if you take it purely in its international development framing, it's a sort of 20th century word, term, concept to try and define what the current state of the world was when the term began to be used. It's not that development wasn't happening like before that. It's not that even the concept of international development wasn't ongoing. But, you know, so for many people, they frame the notion of international development as a 1940s onward, a post-Second World War phenomenon. But I don't think that it makes any sense to isolate it just for the time period 1946, 1947 onwards, the end of the war, the beginning of the UN, to where it was today. So it's probably better to, if you were to draw a continuum, a timeline, going back as far as you want to and coming to however close to where we're standing at this moment in time today, words like mercantilism and going back in time, how did colonization take place in very different ways? I think we're using the word as a very northern Western concept, and so it depends who's using the word, what they mean by it, and how they define it. And I'll jump to economics as well. We're going to get to this now, but economic development and economic growth, two very interesting terms, just juxtaposed and problematized to make scholars, students of international development, defined in a particular way, think about this. But if you think about it, the world, it's a very populated place, and I don't know how many people there are in the world, but if you had to ask 1% of 1% what the term meant, they might have a definition for you. The other 99 point whatever percent aren't going to even understand what the concept is. So, it's challenging to try and say, what does this mean and what does it mean, and how, as a powerful encompassing term. But, I think development, colonialism, colonization were the roots, the origins from a white northern Western perspective of where we came from and where we are in this field today. But again, if I stood at a moment in time and asked a modern day, very smart development economist standing in India what international development meant, they would give me a very different perspective. They would give me a very different perspective of what economic growth was and what economic development was. I think we're using it and we're channeling what we've learned, and we're channeling it in certain kinds of ways. So I think it's very hard for me to put my finger on something and say, well, for me, this is what it is. And to be perfectly frank, I've only worked in the field for about 22 years, which to you might sound like a long time, but it's really not a long time in the bigger picture of things. And what I mean by that is, before I came to teach at Clark University, concept of international development probably crossed my mouth once a year, and I didn't even know what it meant. And then when I started to have to work in the field, I had to start thinking, what does it mean to me, and what do other people define it by? So I think it's a dynamic term. I'm not trying to get away from the essence of it. It's a dynamic term. It's ongoing, it's rambling, it's amorphous, and it depends who's using it, what they certainly mean by it. And I would not want to, frame it in any one particular way or direction.
To piggyback off of your ideas, it does seem like development does have a very dynamic definition, and it seems like that has changed over time, especially depending on who's using it. Going back a little bit further, I was wondering if we could talk about some of the colonial origins of development. We talked a lot about the 1940s, but globalization has come in waves. I'm curious, did colonizers see their actions as development? Did they see what they were doing as something that was beneficial only to them, or did they think there was some benefit to their colonies as well? What was international development to them?
Yeah, I'm going to try and hold your question, and I'm probably going to forget it because it was really, really nicely framed. But I'm going to go back to contextualize how I'm going to answer it, and that is, it's so easy for us to go onto AI, onto Google, into ChatGPT, and pull a whole lot of information and sit and synthesize that and figure out what we mean by what was colonization. What colonization really was is very hard to define, to even figure out, because people didn't neatly document. They didn't document what they were doing. They were just doing life. People were setting out from Portugal or from the Netherlands or from wherever it was. How they even knew to sail around Africa to get to the spice countries, to go and trade and barter, much of that was, some of it was documented, I'm sure, on paper, but voyagers, explorers returning, but I think they were just going and doing life. People who had the resources to be able to build a ship that was seaworthy, to be able to sail many, many thousands of miles to go and do something and come back. to get a commodity which was not available in Europe. Let's just focus this on Europe for now, because I don't know enough about how this happened in the Asian context, in the African context. I'm sure that if you really use the concept as a lens or a tool and looked at Africa and looked at different countries or different groupings of people in Africa, north, south, southern, western, whatever it is, there were forms of colonization going on there again. So what is this, in what particular context are we using this? And so it's for us standing in the modern period, in the modern time, looking back, we look at people who have taken history, sometimes oral histories, sometimes documentation of travels of people, and we're trying to make sense of it. So what did they do? I don't think anybody left a port in England sailing to some strange place with a notion that they're going to go and colonize. I think this was a name given to what happened when people went and did stuff. So, South Africa was colonized, just because it's my example, was colonized in different ways. Some of them we're only really beginning to figure out who these different colonizing groups were, but there's evidence of European colonizers, depends how you use the term, landing on the shores of southern Africa and interacting with local people. But officially, Vasco da Gama, Portuguese explorers landed at certain places, planted across, moved on. Some of them stayed behind. We don't really know. But the official story that is there is 1652, the Dutch landed at the Cape. And they weren't even colonizing. They were really looking for a place. This is what history teaches us, looking for a place to grow crops and have fresh water, so that sailors trying to get to the east, the spices, would have a place to stop off on their way back. And from a particular perspective, looking at it like that, that was, I guess, a form of colonization, but it's not, if you look at it in its pure textual theoretical form today, nobody colonized anybody. They just landed there and kind of tried to protect where they landed and whatever. Not that they didn't commit atrocities. I think the atrocities happened when they moved into the interior and got greedy and began to want to move further and further and further. So, when does colonization start? What is it really called? Do you have to create a settlement and plant a British flag in order to say it's now a colony? If you don't plant the flag and you just take off on your own and you create your own flag, are you colonizing on behalf of the crown or aren't you? So it's really hard to say this is what colonization is. It's almost a description of various stories woven and threaded together. And then anybody reading that story has an interpretation of what it is that you're trying to say in a pure postmodern, post-structuralist way anyway. So does that make some sense?
Yes, it does. It seems like from the European point of view, they have economic reasons as to why they are interested in these ports and in these colonies. So in order to make these colonies more efficient or to be able to produce more output, say agricultural crops, raw materials, whatever the case may be, they will usually try and alter things, create infrastructure, create housing, maybe build schools as well. And so at the time, were these people thinking that they were practicing international development, or did they see themselves as transacting in this new global system?
Yeah, I don't even think more to the latter point that you made, they were transacting, but I don't think there was any real planful intent. I think people were going. So when the Dutch landed in what is today Cape Town in 1652, I don't think they had a clue they didn't have a clue about what the interior looks like. Whereas I think Papua New Guinea is a good example. There are parts of Papua New Guinea that are very impacted by modern Western society, right? There's some impact, but so there is some evidence of people living in very conventional, I wouldn't even say traditional, but just ways. But we can fly over that with a satellite and take pictures of it. We know exactly what's there. We can use a satellite to find out what minerals there are. We can go and colonize those people and do what we want because we know exactly where these different pockets of minerals are without even setting foot there. These Dutch settlers that arrived in Cape Town, somebody must have had some sense of what to do, and where to land, where there would be soft sand and not a rock to land on, whatever it might be. And then they just got there and started to do life, right? And then they were probably attacked by the local people. So they built that fort, which still exists in Cape Town. So I think there's sort of different ways of thinking about this. Whereas, so in 1652, when the Dutch arrived, they just merrily inhabited and they moved into the interior and some integrated, whatever. When the British arrived officially in 1820, they came with intent. There was already some kind of understanding and mapping of the South African, Southern African sub-region, and they came there with, the intent to do something, to inhabit land or whatever. So if you think of, and there are waves of these, and they're not all exactly the same intensity or whatever, but at the end of the Second World War, I don't know if it happened at the end of the First World War, I'm sure it probably did, but wouldn't quote that as a fact, but the soldiers fighting in the First World War were sent to parts of South Africa to R&R, right? So they created places. Why they sent them all the way there, I don't know, but to recuperate, people who'd lost limbs and whatever it is. At the end of the Second World War, a lot of returning soldiers, they didn't know what to do with them in the UK, so they sent them to what were then the colonies. And so, my wife comes from a history of her grandfather coming out, not on behalf of the Queen, but with the blessing and the support and the resources of the Queen to come and settle in the Eastern Cape. And so that's originally where the 1820, so the 1820 settlers arrived. This is a full 120 years later, another sort of wave of so-called colonists arrived. So, what happened to the indigenous people between 1652 and 1945, and it continues today, if you really want to think of it, modern colonization, wealthy industrial, well, the Guptas, not a name that most people know about, but the Guptas are a family, I don't know a whole lot about this, of Indian, Indian, not these bastardized versions of how we use the word Indian, who came to South Africa, who figured that there was an opportunity to become wealthy and work with the African National Congress. And there are all kinds of claims of taking over the state and state capture, as they call it, and whatever. So, what is colonization? Does it continue on today? It's just in a different form, so it's really hard. It's really hard to pin it down to one thing, but it's also silly not to actually name it and claim it, because how do we talk about something if everybody's saying, no, it doesn't mean that to me? Like, what is the central conversation here?
Right.
And maybe that's why we often latch on to this notion of economics, because from a very white Western Northern way of thinking about it, economics is one way, one discipline with which to look at this. More recently, we've looked at it through anthropology and through sociology and psychology even, but I think I don't think anybody came to South Africa in 1652 or 1820 or beyond with economics in their mind, whether it was economic growth or economic development. I think those are all things that we've looked back in history on and said, I can use this as a tool to make sense of and name and claim what happened there from my own humble perspective.
I think that's a very good way to transition to our next point. So you touched upon a lot of these European ideas of colonialism or development at the time and kind of how they thought of what they were doing. So now I want to turn more towards a more modern or American perspective. Could you please tell me a little bit about Walter Rostow and Arthur Lewis, maybe some of their ideas in international development and how and kind of their legacy within the field?
Yeah, I mean, so you're picking on two people here. And it makes me wonder how many, just thinking about Indian students, I picked up an Indian student who was walking around Belchertown yesterday. He was just walking down the road and he had a manila envelope under his arm. And I realized he was lost, but I was on the phone. So I parked on the side of the road, finished my conversation, and he was further down. And I stopped next to him and I said, can I give you a ride somewhere? And he said, yes, please. He needs to get to Amherst. he was walking in the wrong direction. He was walking out of Belchertown towards Palmer. Anyway, long and the short of it was, I took him back into Belchertown. I put him next to the bus stop, and I said, "This bus will take you into Amherst. There's a bus system here." I just asked him a little bit about himself, and he's a student from India, and he's studying business at the business school at UMass. And I was thinking about, as you were asking, I wonder if I asked him what he means by modernization or what he means by international development. I really wonder what he would say to me. Would he regurgitate what he's learning in business here in terms of economics or whatever? Is he going to invoke his education in India, and who were his Indian teachers in school and who were his Indian professors, and what concepts or theories did they draw on to teach him how the world works? If I had to go back to his father, who I don't know was educated formally or not or whatever, and say to him, what is modernization, what is international development, what is economic development, I don't know that he'd have answers. He would need me to explain what I meant by them, and then he'd need to take it. So, I think Rostow is, all of these people stand at a moment in time, at a moment in history, which is surrounded by politics, it's surrounded by economics, it's surrounded by, on a global and on a micro level, and they're making sense of the world from their own education and training, from their own experience of the world. Obviously, these are intellectuals, so what they're doing is they're taking what is and they're going beyond that, because the purpose of academics is to go beyond what is and produce something new called knowledge. And they're producing something called knowledge, drawing from data from the past. So that's what Rostow did. He looked at data from the past and he tried to make sense of it and say, how did we land up here? And he said, well, maybe if I look at this data set here, and I look specifically at Europe, it seems like these countries went through waves of development, right? And so they went from being something that he would define as not being modern to being modern. And he said, that's a cool way of thinking about it. Let me go and take that same lens and look at another place and another place. And the more this lens that he was looking at the world seemed to make sense of things, the more it confirmed for him that this was a good idea. Then he probably took that theory and threw it out into the world and said, all right, how's this sound to you? And other people would have said, hey, that sounds cool. Was there not a Chinese person standing at that same moment in time, looking across the world differently, coming up with a different, interesting, parallel, similar model of what economic growth and development means? I'm sure there must have been, think about how many people there are, must have been another 50 people doing exactly the same thing. Why did Rostow's model really resonate and find purchase, and why did it become used? Because he was white and he was Western and he was Northern and he had the resources to motivate that. So you have those kinds of theories, and is Rostow's theory wrong? I can still look at countries today and think about how they're going. I can look at groups of people and think, are they going through these stages? But there's some essentialist notions of how things happen that are woven into that equation. When he was standing there at a moment in time, I challenged some of the modern day, postmodern, post-structuralist critics to have stood next to him at that moment in time and critiqued his work. It's easy to stand in today's moment with all AI and whatever we have and talk smack back at Rostow's theory. But when he was standing there, that's what made sense to him, to whatever. So what does a modern novice scholar of international development want to do? He wants to understand what was going on, where, how. And that's one theory. If you look at Arthur Lewis, he was looking at this from quite a different perspective. He was looking at from the colonized, not the colonizer's perspective. Not that Rostow ever probably even thought of himself as white and privileged and whatever, but so those are all terms that we've laid onto these people. So I guess Lewis was looking back at this and saying, well, there's a different way of thinking about this, And then again, we're looking at this particular little thin slice. It's all in English. What percentage of the population speaks English? Not a lot today, right? Why is it this powerful language that the English spoken word and written word has such power in the world? Well, that's a product of how the world was colonized as well, right? But I'm sure that there were people standing at other moments and places in the world that would have talked back to Rostow and Lewis. I'm going to give you one very quick example of how I, from my psychology background training, Ivan Illich, I will get to some of these others that you invoked now, but Ivan, I'm sorry, not Ivan Illich. Illich is, and the name that I'm looking for is Vygotsky, Lev Vygotsky, right? It's a very interesting phenomenon. Lev Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist working in the Soviet Union on issues related to cognition and social cognition and how people learn and whatever it was. At the very same time, moment, historically, politically, that people were doing this on the Western side. And the kinds of structures and thoughts that he was coming up with, like scaffolding and whatever it is, people were coming up with on this side of the Iron Curtain, and they didn't have anything to do with each other. They had absolutely zero. There was no intellectual pollination between these two. So it would be naive of us to think that these Rostow, Lewis, standing at their little moment in time, didn't have contemporaries that have just never found their voice acknowledged, affirmed, and put into literature and theory. And so I think when we read, when we're educated in a northern, white, Western, predominantly male, still at the stage, way of looking at the world, we've got to accept that we're looking through kaleidoscope with only one or two colors showing, and we're not really seeing the world through the full spectrum of colors. I think, and that's the challenge, and that's the pity of it, is that we really don't see these other perspectives. It may make Rostow's theory much more powerful and much more grounded if we had some of these other theories to compare and contrast it with. That's the way that I think about these two, particularly when I'm teaching about international development. One last thing I will quickly say, and I'll give it back to you, and that is that, remember, I'm teaching about this. I don't practice international development, although I don't think anybody can stand in the world and say they're not part of international development, broadly writ, because I'm consuming goods. My consumption of goods is by choice. Which companies do I support? Which companies don't I support? Where I put my pension money, my investments, my savings, all has to do with how the world functions as a big global economy, right? And you can either support it by those kinds of decisions that you make, or you can try and challenge it and turn it in a different direction. Is my money in the market in renewable energies, or is it in coal and oil? And so I don't think any of us can stand and say so I can't teach my classes and then just say I'm teaching this theoretically. I'm also practicing it. It's so much easier to critique the ideas, but it's so much harder to critique our own lived practice of it. And we're all part of it. Globalized. Sorry, you were going to go down a different rabbit hole.
Well, I think some of Rostow or Lewis's ideas do merit criticism, and you mentioned how they're a product of their time. I think that's very much true in some of their motivations, you could say, and how those then penetrate into policy or action. So I'm just curious, what was going on at the time of Rostow and Lewis, and what were some of their ideas that did merit criticism, but also who are the people who are criticizing them and why?
Yeah. So you're asking for a lot of sort of fine-grained analysis, and I don't have that for you. What I will say to you, just picking on Rostow, set aside Lewis for a moment, is, do you remember, our department was called the Department of International Development, Community and Environment, right?
Hmm.
And we considered ourselves interdisciplinary. And I remember one past provost arriving at Clark saying, if you're really an interdisciplinary department, where's the historian? Where's the philosopher? I didn't give it a lot of thought at the time. I just thought, he really doesn't understand what we mean. But we weren't really interdisciplinary. We were cherry picking which disciplines we wanted to interact with, right? And I'm saying this because I don't understand American politics, and history that well. But Rostow was. It's probably easier and better to understand Rostow if you look at where he was educated, who his peers were, who his mentors were. He wasn't a young, upstart 22-year-old with a PhD. He had some substance behind him. He was talking, he was writing about the world and interpreting the world and talking about the world. He was talking to people who were going to consume what he was talking about, politicians, congressmen, whatever. So again, I'm not a big fan of Rostow's stages of growth theory. I'm also not an informed critic of it. I just think that if we had a philosopher, if we had an historian, if we probably had a linguist, if we had a whole bunch of really cross-disciplinary people looking at Rostow, why was he using those kinds of words? Takeoff, my mass consumption, as an international development professor, so-called. I would make up what those terms are, but somebody in the English department would have a very different interpretation, and their interpretation may help us understand a nuance in consumption that we don't think about when we think about these kinds of things. What were those things? We were in the Cold War era for both of these thinkers. We were in the post-colonial era. Things were unfolding. Countries that had been controlled by the core or whatever world system theory you want to invoke here, countries emancipating themselves, being emancipated, whatever it is. And they were trying to name what was going on in a very complicated, complex environment, political, economic, social, whatever. And not only, if you look at the world in those terms, but their particular little moment in life. Who were their peers? Where was Lewis standing at his moment in time? Who were his intellectual peers? Who were his intellectual critiques? All of these things have to be thought about when you think about what he wrote about, why he wrote about it, why he wrote about it. And who did he think was consuming his work? I think all of those things are really important to understand. I'm not a historian. I'm not a scholar of US politics, so it's hard for me to really, or British politics for that matter, or Caribbean politics or whatever it is. But I think you would need to know those and understand those to have a proper understanding. I'm going to jump to one thing quickly. I've decided that I asked a couple of students just some interesting questions. They were your class, the graduating international development class, and I asked them some questions about countries in the world. And honestly, I think they're very normal for their group, but I don't think most people would be able to name 50% of the countries of the world, let alone what the capitals are, let alone put their finger on a map and say, that's where Papua New Guinea is. That's where the Gambia is. I don't think they would. And I'm wondering how I'm teaching international development with and to and for a particular group of people where we don't even have a very rudimentary understanding of who's who in the world. So I've decided I don't care whether the department likes it or not. I'm going to actually take a tiny piece of each class and move around the world and just get people to talk about, where does Argentina begin and where does it end? Well, why is it where it is? Because in the end, if you're going to work in this field of international development, it doesn't matter whether you'll never work in Argentina. Argentina is in some remote, peculiar way, and you might be working in Thailand, but there is still a connection between understanding Argentina and Thailand. And I think that's what we're missing currently in international development. We talk about interdisciplinarity, but we're all just taking our discipline and carving this thing up from our disciplinary perspective and really not thinking about, this is a much bigger conversation. It is a much bigger conversation. So I'm going to do that in development theory this semester and just see how it goes.
Well, I like that idea, and hopefully you can open up some people's minds and they can learn a little bit more about the world outside of the US.
And mine, I'm claiming that 50% of people don't know. 95% of the world don't know much more than the province that they grew up in,
Right.
So I'm not blaming them. I just think if this is going to be your field, then you have a responsibility to know more than simply what Rostow meant or Lewis meant and be able to use the rhetoric. You kind of need to have a better soil to grow that from.
Right. No, I could not agree more. And I think for the Americans in the class, it will be very useful just because America tends to be very inward looking and we don't really look beyond ourselves. And like you said, a lot of people tend not to get out of their province or state here. So I think that would be very worthwhile. Going back to development, it seems like in the past, economists were very influential within the development field. And now it seems like economists should not be even allowed in the room for discussions anymore, or maybe they should have less influence is a better way of putting it. I'm curious why that is. We are an economics podcast, and so of course we want
Yeah,
economics to be represented. So why has economics been seen as a little bit less palatable within development?
I understand what you're saying about this being economics podcast. I've never even taken a course in economics, right? Everything I kind of thought about and learned about, I've had to learn by osmosis or whatever it is. But so let's get back to disciplines. Economics is in theory a discipline. I never really thought about why disciplines are called disciplines until a couple of years, and naively so, right? A couple of years ago, a professor at Clark from the economics department was talking about being disciplined in your discipline. And it's like I sat around and thought about that for a while. And I thought, wow. And so what I'm making of it, I didn't get into the conversation, but I think what this person was saying was that you need to understand, if you're an economist, you need to understand, and you call yourself a professor in economics, you got a PhD, let's say you're not a professor yet. You need to be disciplined so that you understand the current hegemonic narratives and theories and where does it begin, where does it end, right, of economics. Do you understand micro and macro development economics? I don't even know what these things are. So economics is a discipline. Geography, mathematics is a discipline. So you've got these different disciplines. Economics, if a psychology is a discipline. I think if you had to take economics, and here I think about UMass Amherst, right, and a little bit that I know, people that I've met from the broad spectrum. One of our really good friends, we just incidental friends, he was on the very right-hand side of the economics department at UMass, and he was considered a little bit of an outlier, right? Because he thought about economics in very conventional, traditional ways. And then UMass is notorious for having some very progressive leftist Marxist economists as well. And these people don't even talk to each other. So, it made me think about what is the discipline? Which one are you disciplined in? Can you be a PhD student and have the whole spectrum, and it's dynamic, right? And it's continuously moving in time as well. But, can you be disciplined across the whole spectrum? So back to your question about why did economics find purchase in people's thinking, and then why has it lost favor? So back to my question about psychology. Psychology is so huge, and you've got behaviorists, whatever. And so if the world's welfare, if global markets, if global financial systems, if banking was based on psychology, the discipline of psychology, we would practice banking, we would practice global markets very, very differently. We use economics to, it's the discipline which kind of runs and informs our thinking about how the world trade works and whatever it is. When it worked all in our favor, when the world was still much colonized by the smaller group of colonizing people and thinkers and power, northern, western, white male predominantly, whatever, economics had a lot of power. And if you knew a lot about economics, you had a lot of power. You could talk to people and explain the world, and people would and ah, even though they were a disciplined psychologist and they probably had a psychological perspective on all of this, it was the discipline that was the strongest, right? But with all the pushback against the IMF and the World Bank and various other development banks who used economic modeling and economic thinking and economic theory, that pushback has kind of, I think, has not painted economics into a corner. That would not be the right metaphor, but has sort of pushed economics back to becoming much more defensive about how it is. So I look at every day I look at my investment account, and I look at how the stock market is going. It's terrible, but I look at it once a day. And then I look at what this little caption that says how markets are trending. And so much of the market today has to do with the governor of the Reserve Bank. And is he going to, reduce rates, or is he going to increase rates? He's an economist. These are all economists sitting there making decisions about inflation. I don't even understand these concepts, but inflation and hyperinflation and whatever it is, and looking at economic data and making decisions about interest rates, right? Those things trickle down to me, and I see my investment account going up by 20,000 one week and coming down by 11,000 another week. That's my pension, right? He's making some whimsical decision based on his discipline and his economic thinking and what he thinks is best for the overall country and markets and whatever. And I'm looking at this and thinking, shoot, I'm going to have to work for another year if I want to make my money last as long as my life is going to last. So I think this fear that these economists who seem to understand the world differently to the average person, their dominant disciplinary way of thinking has been pushed back against people who pushed back against by people. And they're saying, why should an economist decide whether I can retire early or not? Bhutan, what is their criteria? Gross national happiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we think about are people happy in the United States? Let's base the interest rate on whether people are happy rather than whether there are inflation, employment, production data that's here to support it. It's the dominant discipline, and so the highest tree will catch the most wind. I think that's the reason that economics is what it is. Economists are who they are, and why there's so much pushback against them, because they affect our lives in very fundamental ways, which we don't understand, but we've just got to accept.
And what are some of the disciplines or subjects that are now growing in influence now that economics is waning?
Yeah, I wonder if you remember going to go and visit the World Bank. I'm not going to name names, but you sat at the World Bank, and I'd be really interested to get that class together and just talk about, so what was that all about? What was it about for you? How did that experience really go? But if you'd met the person that we spoke to at the World Bank, and we were sitting in a pub, and he didn't tell you who he worked for and what he did, but you just spoke to him, what would you have thought his discipline was?
Probably international development, or yeah, maybe development economics, maybe sociology, something along those lines.
Right. So I think that transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity and embracing disciplinary perspectives with the intent to find the fuller picture of things is probably where we're going, rather than one discipline winning out over another. Ed Carr used to say this, of the couple of things that I sort of agreed with Ed Carr about: having a perspective on the world that is intentionally embracing of the fact that your discipline is only seeing a certain slice of the puzzle, of the pie, and that you cannot see the bigger picture unless you are very intentionally and willful about saying, so what would a psychologist think here? What would a geographer think? What would a sociologist think here? And trying to weave that into the equation. I don't think there's one discipline that is displacing it. So what happens? You're a white guy, I think. I'm not sure. I've never really asked you that, but I'm a white guy. And I kind of look at the world, and I am fully supportive of it, but I'm very aware of my piece of the world is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. I used to always think that I was the world, right? That's the white guy, and I sort of owned the world because I was that stupid and naive. And now I'm realizing how really small my little space is in the world. When your space in the world conceptually becomes limited, you become defensive, right? And you try and protect that little bit of space that you suddenly realize you didn't have a bigger space. But I think that's probably what economics is doing now, is realizing that other disciplines are just as strong and powerful in interpreting what's going on in the world and should be informing policy out of the World Bank and the IMF and the Asian Development Bank and whoever they are. And so economists are just probably finding their rightful niche in the world, which isn't thinking they are the world, just imagining they're a piece of the world. So I don't know that they're waning. I just think that they're accepting some hubris and some humility and saying, I need to speak to, people beyond my discipline. So I don't think economics will ever lose its power. We're just going to pretend that it doesn't have that power and imagine that other disciplines have equal power, but it still will probably rule the roost for a long period of time. It's just the default, the way we think about the world.
Right. Well, I think if you tend to look at things through a purely economic lens, that is when things can start to go wrong. That's when you can start to see a lot of environmental damage, let's say, or you start to see a lot of exploitation of workers' rights, things like that. So I can understand why maybe looking at things purely from economics or pursuing things purely from an economic lens may not
Yeah,
make sense. And I think economics itself is going through quite a bit of a change. A lot of economists are debating kind of what even is the point of economics. They call it the
right.
dismal science within its own field. And so, yeah, it will be interesting to see what comes out of it. Some people are trying to steer it towards a more empirical
Yeah.
point of view. Some people are trying to make it more theoretical. And so, for better or for worse, hopefully it will be a little bit more beneficial towards people's lives.
Just before you jump off that point, I don't want to derail, but again, I think both of us are using the word economics and economists with a certain imagination of who these people are and which of these economics they're practicing.
Mhm.
And if we were saying, how does a very far left economist, I don't know what that even means, would think about this discipline, and how would a very far right economist think about this discipline and what their role is, you'd have two very often 180-degree opposing, contesting perspectives. So, like, what is economics and who's practicing it and what kind of economics are they practicing? I think is all part of the conversation about economics.
Right. So, but my final point was, and I just wanted to play devil's advocate here for a little
Yeah.
bit, but we've talked a lot about some of the critiques of Rostow, Lewis, their contemporaries, and even some of the critiques of economics within international development. But again, just to play devil's advocate, I'm doing this research for USAID right now, and it's incredible some of the progress that we've made, say 20, 30, even 50 years ago. There's a great piece from Branko Milanovic in Foreign Affairs where he talks about inequality between countries or between continents is starting to decrease. It's now more about inequality within countries. A lot of the living conditions in countries in, say, Africa or Asia that were really bad are now some of the best examples of development success stories we could give. And a lot of this is due in part to things like capitalism or some of the ideas from the big push. And so while these are ideas I may not necessarily embrace, I think it'd be foolish to write them off completely. And so I'm kind of just curious, do these ideas have merit just because we are starting to see a shift in international development thinking? Or is there something that we could learn from them that would be useful for whatever the next phase of international development or globalization is?
No, I mean, I think that's a great framing of it. And, huh, I think that if you, these economic principles, these economic theories that people are basing decisions on about trade agreements. If we have a particular trade agreement, it's based on certain ways of thinking economically, but it's also got to do with how people will behave, right? Behavioral economics, whatever. I think if we don't hold on to our discipline or a particular disciplinary perspective too hard, we need to understand it. We need to understand these different pieces of it. I don't know how you were taught development economics. I don't, I have so many perspectives on what goes on in that class, so I don't really know and understand. But if you took everything that you learned in that class and then turned to international development and then took the course on international development thinking, theory, practice, and politics before having taken a very comprehensive development economics course, you may engage Lewis and Rostow and all these other people in a very, very different way. So to teach them concurrently is interesting. Similarly, if you had to take a course on what is international development and what are the critiques of international development and how's this history being described and what is this thing that we're looking at, and then take an economics course, you may engage with that economics material very, very differently. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is a friend of mine taught me a long time ago, and I use this silly metaphor in class. We need to sort of hold things lightly. If you've got a little bird in your hand and you hold on to it too tightly, you're going to smother it, right? So economics is a way of thinking about the world. I do need to understand it in sufficiently to use it as a thinking tool, but it isn't the truth. It isn't even a truth because there are multiple truths within the discipline of how economics is practiced. So I think the goal should be to say, how much do I need to know about the principles of all these different disciplines, and which of them can I use and apply to help me understand what the current reality is? How do I influence the current reality to be better? And better is such a relative term, right? The SDGs and the MDGs, or whatever they were called originally, but are just intents to judge something and make it better. There may be people sitting in the world who say, my literacy rate is fine. But if I want to interact with the bigger world, I've got to pretend that my literacy rates are too low and my people's literacy. So I'm going to embrace this principle, but I'm never going to actually get there because in actual fact, we don't need it. So I think, being able to draw on all the disciplines and see their merit and see their application and see how they're useful at a moment in time and come back to them at another moment in time and say, I was wrong. That economic thinking that I was applying wasn't really very good, which brings me back to what I think the guy at the World Bank was saying. He was saying, we're not doing research to know what is, we're doing research to know what isn't. We're doing research to know what could be, what might be. We're doing research to know what is really not working and not working well. And we're hoping that that will be consumed but the truth of it is, how much of us have the time to go and be really saturated in all good thinking and useful thinking? We tend to take what it is that we have in our toolbox at a particular moment and solve the problem with the toolbox that we have, instead of thinking about a toolbox being something that continuously gets changed and needs to change. And I didn't realize that you were very engaged with economics and you came thinking through a very economic lens. You had counterparts in your class that came from social sciences. You had people in your class that came from disciplines that have absolutely nothing to do with international development.
Right.
And I'm wondering what they thought when we spoke about the word development. Whereas you had something going on. And I think that's just iconic of and captures exactly what we're talking about here now, that 15, 18 people in that class were listening to the readings and the text and what was being discussed and making up for themselves what this meant and how they're going to use it. And I think that's the sort of levity and lightness that we need to, levity is the right word, I don't know, but lightness that we need to hold this all with and say they're tools to help us think and understand. I think the one thing that we don't do, let me just close out with this. I think there's very little accountability left in the world. And I'm not sure who should be held accountable to whom and who has the authority, but I think all of us jump to finding solutions to things without ever being held accountable to how we analyze the problem and what we put in place to solve it, and whether our solution, so-called solution, actually did help or didn't help. We just do and move on, and we never held accountable for any of that stuff. And I think, maybe economists are stopping and saying, well, I can't just say if we increase the lending rate to country X, which would drop their ability to sell their currency, blah, 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 people would have a better life. I think they're saying, well, they could, but I don't know that for sure. So maybe they're beginning to hold the discipline a little lighter and not try and imagine that they have the answers. That would be my hope anyway.
I think it's a little bit challenging just because we want to be able to point to 20 years ago and say, look, we're so much better than we are now. And so, yes, sure, maybe we had to do some things that weren't as savory as we'd like them, but look how much better off we all are. And maybe that's true and maybe that's not. And that's up to everybody else to determine. I think everybody's changing around international development, and how we understand the world has changed over time. And I think it will continue to do so. And it's interesting to see where some of these directions are going, especially within economics, for me at least. I was first introduced to international development in my economic growth and development course. Maybe it should have been called economic growth and economic development. I remember reading this textbook and I had to kind of reread it for one of my papers this past semester. And yeah, I engaged with the material very differently back then compared to now. I think back then I probably would have had a very purely economics point of view, whereas now I take it more from a more sociological view, you could say.
And looking at that list of provoking questions, ideas that you had, the difference between economic growth and economic development, there's the sort of standard, like, what do we mean by these two terms? And there's a sort of accepted way of thinking economic growth is this and economic development is that. And I think it would be much easier to say, well, these are ways of thinking about growth and development, but to step back and say, this is a tool. It's just a thinking tool. I mean, they're
Right.
words. And so when I think about the world and I think about what's happening in a particular place in the context of my life or whatever it is, and I think about economic development, that's a useful tool for now. But I'm not trying to achieve development or growth. I'm trying to look at the world through this lens that juxtaposes growth and development, or tries to make a distinction so that you can see. And I think if we thought about all of these concepts, Rostow, Lewis's, anybody else's, as really cool ways, lenses to put on my spectacles to see different nuances in the world, that would be helpful.
Hmm.
It's when we embrace them as realities or truths or critical points that we're not prepared to accept that it becomes really challenging. When you throw all of these things out because you don't like what they say, that's as silly as not understanding what they say in the first place. So.
Right. And that's what I appreciate about Clark's education is that it is multidisciplinary. And so you can look at things from a different perspective and you can gain a different understanding by doing that.
Yeah, and that's a nice thing to hear. And at the same time, I'm wondering where we all fit in the world. You've all got to go out and find lives and jobs. And, if I have 17 people in my development theory and my project management class, and somebody needs to employ them, I need to say there is no core to this curriculum. The curriculum is producing people who can think divergently and broadly and deeply and whatever. And these are some of the concepts and ideas that they have had to engage. But if you had to ask all 17 of them, what is the difference between economic growth and economic development, you're going to get 17 different answers. That's kind of an interesting way of thinking about what education is.
Hmm.
And why you're paying such a lot of money for something that you can't actually put your finger on and say, well, this is what I learned, right?
Right.
So maybe it's about learning to think rather than what to think would be a good way to frame it.
No, and that was one of the things I appreciated about my courses, just because a lot of what undergrad was is what to think, or at least that's what it felt like. They were teaching us what to
Yeah.
think, or some of these
Yeah.
ideas or concepts within the discipline. And now it feels more like we're learning how to think. Just because I remember in one of my courses, we were learning about hydroelectricity production, and we were looking at the pros of it, the cons of it, and at the end of it, the professor said, I don't want you to leave this class thinking hydropower is all either good or bad. I want you to understand when is it appropriate, when is it beneficial, and when is it not, just because having that understanding is going to be very useful in the real world.
And so just to, I always go back to these kinds of silly philosophical perspectives, but I wonder how many of us that consider ourselves faculty members or even professors practice what it is that we teach. I'm not even going to say preach, but how many of us walk through the world and are as open, broad-minded, self-critical, metacognitive as we're hoping our students would be? And I think the truth of it is, I don't think. And I think we know what we should be. And then we get on with teaching our jobs, and very much our jobs are translating our disciplines for other people. And so you can espouse these kinds of things, but the reality is, do we actually live them and practice them? Would be an interesting research concept.
It's hard to
How
practice
many?
what you preach. So my final question for today, before I let you go, I ask every guest member this: what is
Yeah.
one thing about the world, big or small, you would change?
So Illich, I'd invoked Illich a while back, and my discipline, if you want to call it that, is international comparative education, or non-formal education, broadly writ, or whatever it is. I think at the very core of what Paulo Freire was trying to say, and what Illich was trying to say, and many, 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 many others, and what we're all saying right now, about our local middle school and whatever, is that we seem to have embraced a certain way of thinking about what a modern person is and the fact that they need to be educated. right? And right now, there are students sitting all over the world struggling to get a visa to come to the United States to get an education, right? Because this has value. And it has value because has economic value, right? You'll find a better job. You'll be able to move up in the hierarchy of the world, whatever it is. I wish that we could change how we think about what it means to be educated. And in a pure postmodern sense, I would love for us not to use the word education anymore. Not because it's bad, but because it just has so much power, right? Because I think if we were all educated differently, and here I know you told me not to use curse words, but I'm going to invoke my politics. If we were all educated better, differently, none of us would vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. I have no issue with either or both of them. I have issues with either and both of them as well. But all of us would turn to each other and say, there are 400 something million people in this country. Is this what it's really about? And I think, teaching people that this is how political system works. Political system only works when we vote in it. The political system only works when we don't stand up and say, that's not what I want. I don't want 500 people elected through some very bizarre process and a president who's elected through some very bizarre process to sit there and make policy about my life. I think if we were educated, I hate that word, differently to think about what is good for me, what's good for the person next to me, what's good for you, what would be good for us. What does it mean to be educated? Do I need to learn all different languages at a very rudimentary level so that I can get on with people? Or do I need to learn English so that I can convince and manage people? Right. So if there's one thing that I would love to change is to problematize the way that we currently think about education and broaden what we believe education to be, which ultimately, hopefully, will change what it means to be educated, so that we have a citizenry in the world of billions of people who aren't being cajoled to fit into certain boxes and ways of thinking. And I know it's fantasy. What I'm saying is silly and fantasy, but I think if our education system was intentional about not doing what it's currently doing and doing something much more global, and I hate the word global as well, intentional about making the world a better place by educating, bad word, people to live in a globalized world, you wouldn't have to have policies that stop people from slash and burn, because people would stop each other and say, hold on, guys, that's not good for people down the road. For us now, this is good for us economically. For those people, not so good economically. I just think we're teaching people to fit into the box of the way that we think the way the world works now. Find a job, find a whatever. And I think if we could soften that and move it in a different trajectory direction, that would be my hope, is to revolutionize education so that it's no longer education in the pure Illichian sense of the word.
It'd be interesting to see what that would look like, but I do know that people who think outside the box or the idealists, those are usually the people who tend to change the world for the better.
Yeah. Well, hopefully there are some in your generation. Mine, I've got 10 more years and then I'm out of here. And that you still got a good 50, and it's really on your shoulders. So yeah, younger people need to step up and say, this is the world that I want, and how do I get there?
Well, to quote Kurt Vonnegut, true terror is to wake up one morning and realize that your high school class is running the country. Professor David Bell, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast today. It was great talking to you.
Nathan Greene, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And that's it for this week's episode of the Henry George School Podcast. Thank you for listening, and we hope it made you think. If you'd like to learn more about our research and policy tools, check out hgsss.org. That's hgsss.org. If you'd like to listen to our content as soon as it's published, subscribe to our show. If you like the show, please leave us a rating, review, or even share it with a friend. It goes a long way. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.